And we are live on YouTube. We can begin. Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Philosophical Cafe number 49, our weekly meetings in which we discuss about books and ideas, more or less philosophical. Tonight, we are not going to talk about the book, but we are going to talk about a journal, an academic journal, a recent academic journal on the history of knowledge, Journal for the History of Knowledge. More precisely, we are going to talk about this new field, an interdisciplinary field about which we are going to open the discussion in a moment. Meanwhile, let me welcome our guest, Sven Dupre. Together with Jo Hedesan, we are going to moderate the discussion. And we have a large audience on Zoom. Welcome all, and please feel free to join the discussion at any time. We also have an audience on YouTube. For those of us joining us on YouTube, do not forget that we are welcoming questions in writing, and we are going to introduce them into the discussion. So let's begin without further ado. I will give the floor to Jo to take it from here and address the first question.
Yes, hello and welcome to a new installment of the Philosophical Cafe. Today we will talk about an up-and-coming framework of research, history of knowledge, and about its specialized journal for the history of knowledge. And joining us is Professor Sven Dupre from University of Utrecht, one of the journal's editors. Sven, thank you for being with us today. Let us begin with a very general question. Why history of knowledge? Why do we need this framework, and what does it seek to achieve?
Yeah, thanks, Jo. That's an excellent question, I think, to start with. I think the first question perhaps is what is history of knowledge, and from that it might be sort of following up why we need it. In terms of what it is, I think it can mean very different things to several people. I think there's one view in which it's primarily seen as a sort of almost encyclopedic enterprise, bringing all sorts of different strands together. Perhaps a very good proponent of that would be someone like Peter Burke, writing "What is the history of knowledge?" But without, I mean, a very sort of precise view on the exact boundaries of the field, nor on the sort of a precise definition of what knowledge is, for example. I think then there are other views. I think especially coming from the history of science and from the history of science, which of course is also my own background, it might be sort of seen as an expansion of the objects and the practices that we study and that we've seen growing over the past decades. And from that perspective, it might be on the one hand sort of expansive or be inclusive, perhaps of two things. One is perhaps other forms of of learned knowledge. Other forms of academic knowledge, and I think in particular here about the history of the humanities, which in a technical sense would have been excluded from the history of science as being only about natural science. Of course, you have in other languages, including German, Wissenschaft, it means it's a broad definition. So that might be an expansive definition, that bringing these two fields together in a sense. I think that's what people like, for example, Rens Bart at University of Amsterdam is doing, and what they're doing with their journal. It's the history of humanities. It might also be expansive in the sense of including other forms of knowledge. I mean, think particularly something that I myself have worked on over the past years, artisanal knowledge, for example. But you can also think of other types of knowledge which might not be included at any particular moment in time among what at that point, and that particular place is seen as science. I think another way of defining it might be sort of emphasizing that it is primarily about knowledge in society, in which concepts like circulation, for example, becomes very, very, very prominent, which of course is also again something that has a background in the history of science as a field. I think then to come to the question why we need it, which I think is particularly linked to that. I think we live in a particular moment now, which is why we might want to, talk about the history of knowledge, and that's a moment in history in which it's not only, science as such, which is perhaps sometimes contested, but it's knowledge as such that is sometimes contested. Where on the one hand you see, the word knowledge being used perhaps also as a buzzword in all sorts of policy documents, talk about knowledge society, talk about knowledge as a resource, and that sort of thing. So where there are all sorts of different sort of fields who wants to sort of represent themselves as being knowledge producing. But on the other hand, this is a particular moment in history where also that sort of knowledge capacity of producing knowledge and expertise is also contested. It's not just science that is contested, it's really knowledge that is contested. And I think at that particular moment in time is that we do need something like the history of knowledge, which can sort of historicize and problematize these particular boundaries of knowledge and knowledge enterprises.
So borders are contested, knowledge itself is contested, science is contested. I wanted to ask a sort of personal question, because I have a sympathy towards new fields, because I was always having a problem with my own research. Is my research, well, what kind of field I am dealing with? And take a simple case, I did my PhD on the works of Isaac Newton, someone that everyone worked on one moment or another, from one perspective or another. And I always had very serious troubles defining the kind of research I was doing. Was it history of science? Was it history of philosophy, since I was interested in philosophical concepts of Newton? Was it intellectual history? Was it history and philosophy of science, since I was interested in that from a more contemporary perspective, and so on. And about 20 years ago, there was this movement of let's break the disciplinary boundaries and redefine the history of disciplines in a different manner. So am I doing history of knowledge, Sven?
I think you might be doing the history of knowledge. It very much depends, I think, on. Of course, you can sort of embrace all these sort of, different fields. You can embrace and you can sort of stress, well, it's partly what the history of philosophy was doing. It's partly what the history of science is doing. I think then you really sort of trying to sort of emphasize that we need this because of a sort of internal academic discipline reshuffling that is ongoing, and that might actually help us as researchers to position ourselves within the academic field. I think that's perfectly legitimate to try to do that, and I'm probably something that I personally would also, would do. Yeah. So if people would ask me what it actually is that you're doing in terms of the sort of research that we do on artisanal knowledge, I would say, well, it's a sort of it would fit within that broader field of the history of knowledge. But at the same time, I think it's much more important to really sort of emphasize that this is something that is sort of coming out of the state of the world at this particular time. So I think that other part of it, not the sort of mere expensive part, but the fact that we actually need something like this field, that there is a sort of a need for the sort of questions and perhaps also responses that a field like that can bring, is much more important in a sense. So from that perspective, I think the whole discussion about whether which we also have with the journal, for example, So history of knowledge, I do not see it as a sort of replacement as the of the history of science, neither see it as a replacement of any sort of other field of history of philosophy, intellectual history. I think they all have, their needs to exist. Their right to exist should continue to exist. This is another field, in a sense, which might have branches and links to all these other fields, which comes on top of that and might be asking particular questions which are really at the heart. And I think these are questions about epistemic hierarchies, about boundaries. So they're about, in a sense, not just about, I would say, it's not just about expanding the boundaries of the history of science. It's really investigating how these very boundaries between science and other forms of knowledge are continually shifting and changing. Yeah. And I think that's what is sort of the core why something is history of knowledge. That's also sort of the relevance that we probably be looking for, in particular for journal articles in the for articles submitted in to the Journal for the History of Knowledge. Not that we would not sort of consider publishing something that would be history of science or history of the social sciences or history of the humanities or something of that kind. But in particular, if you're sort of dealing with something that, for example, is at the edge and trying to see in what ways, the humanities and the sciences conflict or collaborate in a particular moment in time, that would be something that we would consider as sort of more to the core of the business of the journal, the scope of the journal. But we try to be inclusive.
I would like to ask, we obviously, well, many of us here are working on the early modern times. And it seems to me that somehow this, history of knowledge works very well in terms of, let's say, pre-modern times. I've always found it a bit strange that you would talk about ancient science or medieval science or even early modern science before the so-called scientific revolution. For instance, for me, studying van Helmont was very much a boundary issue. There's been scholars who have said, oh, okay, he's somehow part of the scientific revolution, he's a precursor, but he was interested in so many fields of knowledge. He was interested in theology, he was interested in practice, he was interested in philosophy. So it seemed to me when I was putting a title to my book, I said, he's looking for knowledge in some way. And I found a lot of scholars that were somehow disgruntled a little bit about just fitting within the science framework because of much of the 17th century, for instance, is about exploration, about trying to find new ways of knowing. So I'm just wondering if this new field appeals for let's say 1700 or maybe even pre-1800s, and how would you pitch it to someone that is trying to fit within the history of science framework, because this is how we, how many people were trying to fit it in.
Okay. Yeah, I thought your question would be slightly going in a different direction. I thought what we're going to ask, and perhaps this is also what you're asking. So let's see. So of course, and I have a background in the early modern period myself, a sort of early modernist who has sort of gone astray and is now also working on 19th and 20th century things. So of course, in the early modern period, or in a period before the 19th century, we're very used to perhaps that idea that what we might be talking about is knowledge, right? Or frame it at least under sort of that category, because we find, as always, and as many historians of science have done, that category of science means something different in 1500 than it actually meant today, or that it even meant, for example, in a century ago. So for us, this is a sort of an almost, I mean, for early modernists, this might be sort of an almost natural sort of umbrella or category to find ourselves under. And it's especially sort of, I mean, it's quite, you know, remarkable that especially historians of science working on the early modern period have actually come closest to sort of embracing, especially in the Anglophone world, embracing something that might be close to, or even the category of the history of knowledge. What I find much more surprising, in a sense, or what was new to me, is that it has quite a bit of appeal also to historians working on more recent periods. I mean, you have, for example, I'm not quite sure whether he is in the room. He might be, but you have the director of the Lund Center for the History of Knowledge. So there are places where history of knowledge now is as such sort of institutionalized in research centers, etc. Lund in Sweden is one of these places. So he is basically considering or talking mostly about the 19th and even the 20th century, and talking very much about public arenas of knowledge. So very much talking about mass media, television, these sorts of sites or mediums in which public arenas, as you would call them, public spheres, I would guess, in which knowledge actors operate. And so also for them, this is apparently something of an umbrella, which I find in a sense much more surprising, and it's perhaps much less expected that they would, that somebody in the 20th century would actually sort of, or someone working on the history of 20th century would actually sort of embrace that. And I find it equally important, something that I see now, and why I think that would also be something that would be typically be falling under the sort of umbrella of the history of knowledge, is so I've worked quite a bit historically also about how artists produce knowledge and what sort of knowledge they produce, sort of typical, very much in the early modern period, but also in later periods. What I find quite striking in the you know, even very recent history is that you see artists now who come to the fore with claims that what they produce is indeed knowledge. Yeah. So you have performance artists in, for example, dance, who over the past 20, 30 years have consistently made claims that what they produce is dance knowledge. Yeah, that they can sort of also grasp that and archive that in, for example, motion banks, and that they can transmit it to other, you know, professions, to other people, that it is, and that they produce, in a sense, also not only transmittable knowledge, but also useful knowledge for these other sectors. So artists now seem to be sort of, you can study that as such. You can study these artists and try to sort of grasp what it actually is that they're producing in terms of knowledge and how they would categorize that. But I find it equally sort of interesting, and would be typically, I think, a question for the history of knowledge, how it actually comes that within these present circumstances and the present days, you know, in these circumstances, that artists sort of feel inclined to sort of package what they do as research and knowledge producing. Yeah? And so that would be an equally sort of important question, which I think would actually speak for actually having a history of knowledge, even of the most recent times. And so I think it is not something that is only sort of relevant for early modernists as such, although it might be sort of the most common sort of background, or the most logical backgrounds, because it's so clear in an early modern period that what we understand under science is something different. So coming from the history of science, but it's also quite useful, I think, and quite attractive as an umbrella, even for the most recent, you know, history of the 20th and even the 21st century.
So I'm just wondering. Well, I mean, so far you've had several issues, I believe, and I'm just wondering in terms of well, historically, has it been where has the weight fallen on the early modern period, on the early times, or has there been, I've seen some very interesting articles on bureaucracy as being knowledge, which was going towards the modern times. So that was quite fascinating in terms of thinking. I mean, it seems to me like the 19th century might be somehow, or the early 20th century might be a bit more difficult to access. But as you're saying, there is a certain appeal to discussing these boundaries that were actually being formed during this time, and discussing how they were formed actually in the 19th century in the history of knowledge.
So I think it is, I mean, given the given what I've just said, and the fact that, and what you're also pointing at, is that sort of early modern history of science has sort of perhaps been sort of the most logical place within the history of science to sort of, I mean, question the category of science. I do think that it is for us a constant struggle to also attract articles and special issues that deal with more recent subjects, but it's definitely not. I mean, from what we've seen now, it's definitely not that it is. I mean, far from exclusive, but perhaps not even the majority of what we published, of what you've published at this point, falls within, you know, the early modern period. And by the way, we publish not just on Europe, but also in other parts of the world. And in that sense, I mean, that category of the early modern is even much more problematic than it probably is within a European context. So, but we have published, for example, the special issue on bureaucracy that you're mentioning as basically chronological scope, I think, from pretty much 1500, 1600, all the way up to the end of the 19th century. We have another special issue coming out on ignorance this year, which has, I think, it's a chronological emphasis on the 19th and 20th centuries, and has, for example, one article in there on the history of artificial intelligence and algorithmic surveillance, for example, which is very, very recent stuff. So it's definitely more broader than that. This is not something that only or just appeals to historians of the early modern period. But given, you know, some of its sort of roots in the early modern history of science, you do get, you know, that is a logical sort of place for many historians of early modern science to go to, but certainly not exclusive in what the journal publishes.
We have a number of questions, but before giving the floor to these questions, I would like to challenge you a bit. So your second argument for why is history of knowledge important was precisely to say that we need to distinguish between what is knowledge and what is not. And we live in a time where fake news and all sorts of equivalents of not knowledge, non-knowledge, pretending to be knowledge, are assaulting us on every side. Now, the question of what is knowledge is a question which has a history in history of philosophy. So I was wondering whether it is worth approaching the subject, what is history of knowledge, from a meta question. Is there a history of knowledge?
That's a very good question. It depends on how you mean the question. So if there is a history of not, because I mean, the field as such is pretty new. So if you would define it as a history of the field, would be a very, very short history at this point. I think it's probably worth telling. It might teach us a couple of things, but it would be a very, very short history. Of course, it is. I mean, I would not deny that would be absurd. I would not deny, of course, that there is a lot of thinking about what knowledge is in traditions, you know, in philosophy, and that, of course, might be very much part of what the history of knowledge is all about. And I do think that the field as such is very much in need of a sort of a theory of knowledge, which isn't there and which isn't in place. Yeah, and I'll also reveal that at this moment. I also do not have it in the back of my pocket. We'll sort of reveal it tonight, as this is what is sort of, you know, binding the whole thing together. That would be great. I'll let you know once we're there. But I think that is definitely something that the history of knowledge as a field should work towards. Yeah, so I do think that what is very important, because you say so yes, I think it's there because you might want to distinguish between you know, truth and falsehood. But I think one of the things that an history of knowledge can actually teach us is that there is no such clear-cut distinction at any one time. Yeah, and so there is quite a bit of, you know, a spectrum. There's quite a bit of, and that it exactly can sort of, you know, draw our attention to, you know, uncertainties, yeah, to shifting, so to do that whole spectrum, to uncertainties, to the way that, in a sense, ignorance and knowledge are co-produced, to the role of failure, to the importance of error in knowledge making, and that sort of thing. So I think that is typically something that a history of knowledge can and should do, and I think it's one of the reasons it exists. Yeah, I hope that's sort of a beginning of an answer, but I do not have the theory. But I agree, we would need one.
Well, we have a lot of questions in the chat, and we perhaps should start with the first question, which was from Andrei Moroshoiu. When you ask the question, maybe you just want to say who you are and where you're from, just basic things for the audience to know. Andrei?
Hi, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, we do.
Very good to be with you. Thanks for hosting this, for doing this, and thanks for Sven for talking about the journal. I'm an assistant lecturer at the University of Bucharest in the Department of Theoretical Philosophy. I'm very happy to have Dana as a senior colleague. I guess what I was asking was somewhat of a follow-up to Dana's question. So, you know, ignore the question. Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, now again.
We lost you for just 1 second.
Oh, I see. I apologize for that. I was just saying that maybe this is a follow-up to what Dana was asking. And if you've already answered this, please ignore the question. But it seems to me that this is a very naive take. So, you know, sorry for that. But the history of scientific knowledge, at least, seems to be rife with a bunch of stuff that isn't knowledge, right? Conjectures, wrong methods, hypotheses, idealizations that can't be sort of, you know, paraphrased away, and so on. And it's entirely unobvious to me that these can be teased apart from the kind of stuff that contemporary people with a sober epistemology might brandish as knowledge. And if so, the question might be, well, when you talk about the history of knowledge so conceived, do you mean to be excluding all of this stuff, or do you mean to be including it, or exactly how do you wish to conceive of knowledge in the history of knowledge? So I'm not sure if this is too large a question, if this is too half-baked a question, but I'm really interested. This is fascinating, so thanks so much.
No, thanks. I think it's a great question. So, and it's not naive at all. Yeah. So, no. So I think yes. I mean, the history of knowledge should actually include all what you've just mentioned, and it could be perfectly that sort of history that basically tells about. I mean, where historically. Things shift from being a conjecture to for example, more grounded or more foundational knowledge with higher levels of evidence. I think that's exactly the sort of question that a history of knowledge can pose. If that's within the domain of the natural sciences, of course, a question that I think the history of science has been sort of posing and dealing with for quite some time. So that's definitely something that should be included there. And I do not think by sort of rebranding it as history of knowledge that it sort of particularly excludes anything that is not knowledge. I think even within the history of science, I mean, when talking about where these boundaries are drawn, I mean, much of the history of science is really also about, I think, boundary work with what would be called not science or pseudoscience and that sort of thing. So yes. So a short answer is yes. This is I think part and parcel of what a history of knowledge should be about.
With Jo and Dana's permission, may I ask a very brief follow-up? So I was thinking, for instance, you probably remember this, that Kant thought that Newton's laws of motion are a priori, and they're right. So is there anything that goes from being knowledge to stopping to be knowledge and becoming non-knowledge? And if so, would that also be in the purview of what you're interested in?
Yes, of course. I mean, it would be about the constant shifting. I mean, that's partly what I mean with epistemic hierarchies. I think it's about the constant shifting boundaries between, yes, what is knowledge and not knowledge, what is science and non-science. Historians of science, I think, have dealt with these sorts of questions quite a lot. It becomes, for a history of knowledge, it might become an interesting question to see, for example, in a different domain, I mean, again, talking about the arts, at what point, I mean, something in the arts is considered as being knowledge productive, and at other points it might no longer be, it might be resisted by certain artists as being sort of knowledge productive, or might be contested. So it's both, I think, the knowledge production as well as the contestation of that, drawing boundaries also with other activities and different sort of levels of expertise and evidence is something that I think is what the history of knowledge should be doing. But again, I think historians of science have done this for within the field of history for quite some time.
Thanks so much.
We have a number of questions relating to the definition of history of knowledge. So I will ask Daria Dozrova to go first and then Javier following. Daria.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, I'm Daria. I'm from Moscow, from High School of Economics, and I'm doing this exact early modern something, unclear what, philosophy, science, or theology. So my question was about the method of this field, because speaking about history of knowledge, it seems to me that you are defining it in terms of objects. So you are speaking about questions we can make about what we are interested in this field. That what can you say about the methodological approaches? And in this line of the methodological question, could you explain me the difference between history of knowledge, history of ideas, or intellectual history?
Good. Methodologically, I think historians of science have developed quite a methodological toolbox quite extensively, and so I think the history of knowledge is sort of can take that on board quite a lot. I think it's not just about. I think talking about the history of knowledge, I do think that it's particularly interesting to make connections, I think, with the history of the book and a sort of methodological toolbox that goes together with the history of the book, with the history of communication. That it also very much, given that it's very much about, I think, circulation of knowledge, that it's also very much focusing on the materiality of knowledge. So and that comes with a particular set of methods and tools that you can use to study those. So I think would consider it pluralistic in its methodologies, while paying particular attention to things like materiality, mediation, and that sort of questions. I find, I mean, the history, your particular question about the history of ideas and intellectual history, I find that always a very interesting question. I think one of the attractions, I think, of the history of knowledge above the history of science, and one of the things that I've seen is that it seems to be a field, if you brand it as history of knowledge rather than history of science, for example, that seems to be more attractive to engage with by historians of ideas and intellectual historians. In what that particular attraction is, I think is, I must say, I do not have a 100% good answer to that. But it would be great if there is perhaps even here in the room an intellectual historian who could sort of explain also to us why that would be the case. Yeah, but it's just something that I see is actually the case. Yeah, and we see it actually also in the sort of both in the readership as well as in submissions to the journal for the history of knowledge, that there is from those particular fields more interest than it would probably be the case if this would be you know, a history of science journal. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, going back to just a moment to Andrei's question, which was more, I think, about what knowledge means actually, and just reflecting on where knowledge starts and where it ends. What I found interesting, I was reading Peter Burke's book on what is history of knowledge, which was actually very useful. I was noting how wide the knowledge category can be. I mean, he's at some point he's referring to ancient Greek and just how many words there were for some kind of knowledge. I mean, he was talking about techne, knowing how to do something, about episteme, knowing that, more commonly epistemology, praxis, about practice, phronesis, prudence, and even gnosis, which was basically the highest form of knowledge. Related to this, Carmen Schmechel was actually pointing out how in Polish, for instance, there is still this difference between techne and episteme, and I don't dare to pronounce this, umiec, maybe? Widziec.
Umieć and wiedzieć.
Okay, you better pronounce that. And there is, of course, in French, is there still also this kind of difference between savoir-faire and savoir, which in a way exists also in English, know-how and knowledge. And it's, I mean, what is exciting is about exploring this wide range of forms of knowledge within which are not maybe accepted within the science boundary at the moment.
Yeah, I fully agree. And you have these differences in many many languages. There is also a difference, for example, in Dutch between wetenschap and kennis. Which is not translatable, I think, in English. So I will not try. But there is a difference. I mean, and you would probably see them in English as two different types of knowledge. So you do have that sort of differences, and it's interesting. I mean, even the linguistic question and going to that sort of different sort of terminologies that belong to that knowledge domain is interesting as such. So from that sense, I mean, having that sort of word history would even be quite interesting to do that for you know, a history of knowledge. I agree. I fully agree.
Well, one thing that, I mean, I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but it's such an interesting topic to me is that, it can, you were pointing out about ignorance, and ignorance in terms of a 19th, 20th century, understand the topic. And obviously there is also, it's funny because in my project, we were just talking about docta ignorantia just the other day about the let's say about unknowledge or not knowledge as being somehow also giving access to knowledge, but of a different kind than let's say and this is obviously let's say a medieval early modern approach, but it's interesting because you can go with this on knowledge as well in some directions, and I probably should shut up because I'm talking too much about this story.
No, may I just second Joe question, which is very interesting, and I wanted to add something here precisely, and then perhaps introduce the last question that we received, whether this category of knowledge is not too broad. Because indeed, as Joe was saying, the Greeks already knew that we know something in so many ways. We know so many things in so many different ways. But one can see philosophy or science or different scientific disciplines as evolving by carving out from the cloud of things that we might know one way or another, certain things that we can know in certain particular ways. So that's the episteme and the history of knowledge as epistemology, for example, appeared from this attempt to carve out from various ways of saying I know something, just one way of saying, namely I know with the possibility of providing causal explanations. And this is scientific knowledge, and therefore the history of that becomes history of science. Why would we go back to the cloud of very, very many different meanings of knowledge?
I find it an interesting way of phrasing it, because I think that cloud, as you call it, is still with us. So it's not something that we go back to. If we would go out of the safe, well, it does not exist as such. Yeah, there's no. But if you go out in the streets, I mean, that's the sort of messy sort of cloud of knowledges that you find and that people use all the time. And so going back and doing that history and seeing also that it's been sort of shifting there since, as you call it, the ancient Greeks, but might also be sort of drawn very differently and in very differently interesting ways in other parts of the world than Europe, is exactly, I think, something that might be sort of informative of what people do today. And so it's not necessarily going back. I think it's still there with us. And yes, I mean, there is the risk that this becomes then the sort of the theory of everything, right? That this is just about everything. I think that's the question also that I think Rainy Daston already posed for the first time that she sort of quite programmatically for the Berlin Zentrum für Wissensgeschichte talked about. I mean, this is what we now do. It's history of knowledge. It comes with the inherent risk that it might indeed be a theory of everything. I think there is no way of actually sort of completely countering that unless you actually say, well, you focus on these things which actually matter. It matters now in this particular time of very much sort of cognitive fluidity, where this is constantly contested. It matters that we actually talk about these shifting boundaries, and that's what is center stage. It's not the complete, it's not about being encyclopedic. It's not about sort of giving the great theory of everything. It's about these shifting boundaries. And that's what actually matters to us today, because that's the present state of the world.
Well, if we go back to boundaries, then we have a number of questions. One is from Javier. Maybe
thank you very much. My name is Javier Poveda. I am from Ecuador and I am a PhD candidate in history of science. So basically my question comes with, do you think it is possible to integrate history of philosophy and history of science in the, perhaps more broader than in the Kuhnian sense, perhaps integrate more the new historiographies of science for explaining, for example, the Cold War and the intellectual history, for example, in artificial intelligence and in some other fields. So that's what I've been thinking of during this time. So do you think it is possible? Thanks.
I'm not 1% sure whether I fully understand the question, but if I think what you're asking is whether there is a possibility of integrating history and philosophy, I think that is an endeavor that is, as such exists. I mean, there's a whole field, including conferences, which is about, I mean, I think on one hand is something like philosophy in practice, but you also have an integrated history and philosophy of science sort of field, to which, you know, there's huge communities and even departments, originally departments, who sort of would identify with this. I think that's, you know, perfectly legit, but I do think that that's not perhaps exactly where the core of the history of knowledge is actually at, because these fields are doing that perfectly well, and so this is not something that we necessarily, you know, I'm not talking as an editor of a journal. It's not necessarily something that we would sort of undertake. They're all also journals devoted particularly to that topic and to that field. So I think it's there. People are doing it. It's happening.
Okay.
And
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and there's actually a related question from Richard Kramer, which is putting the questions from an even wider perspective. Richard, can you come in?
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. I'm Rich Kramer. I retired from teaching history of science at Dartmouth just a couple of years ago. So I'm interested, Sven, when we do the history of your journal in 20 years, what kind of a story we're going to tell if it takes off, and if we get something called a discipline in the universities of the history of knowledge, what's the origin story we're going to tell? And are we going to say that this discipline emerged primarily out of what used to be called history of science or history of philosophy? Or are you going to have entries to your journal or other historical disciplines, art history, history of religions, political theory, history of material culture? Are these disciplines also undergoing a kind of methodological conversation about the objects of their study? And are they also interested in shifting toward this thing called knowledge? So are we going to see that the Journal for the History of Knowledge emerged from a number of disciplines, or is it going to be a history of science story?
Yeah. So I think it's not going to be a history of science story. So I think we're completely biased, including myself, because of the own background. And I think most people in the room here also have a background in either the history of science or the history of philosophy, which really, I think, sort of clouds or sort of biases the way we're looking at this, because we're constantly sort of doing the thing, well, this is what the history of science was doing. In what way is what the history of knowledge is doing is different? Or is it, you know, what's the added value? Because we're actually doing already, as a historian of science, quite a bit of this. When you look at it from another perspective, is that you indeed see what you are saying, is that, for example, art historians in Germany now for quite a while have identified themselves with Wissensgeschichte. So I taught for a long time at the Freie Universität in Berlin, history and art history, which really had as one of its main sort of, points of gravity in its research and teaching agenda, history of knowledge. I mean, in German, Wissensgeschichte. And so that's what they identified or wanted to identify with. And I can actually say is that, so you have recent special issues, for example, of History and Theory, which had a special issue on history of knowledge. What you see in there is that when people come, and you had a special issue, I should point out, you had a special issue on the history of knowledge also in the Berichten zur Wissenschaftsgeschichte. So the history of science and humanities is the English title is now, so a different journal. So you quite clearly see in Berichten zur Wissenschaftsgeschichte is that most people contributing to that journal and to that special issue, defining also in programmatic ways what it actually is, compare it to the history of science, because that's what the field is about. When you go to that special issue of history of and theory, it's a much wider sort of back group scope of people. Yeah, you have historians of political thought, you have historians of arts, etc. All the sort of things that you mentioned. And so for them, that question is not even there, and they find it sort of very relevant. And we also see it, I think, now in the submissions to the journal, where we get submissions from people who would be primarily identifying themselves in terms of discipline as for example, art historians, and who would never think of actually never think of themselves as historians of science, but would also probably never think of actually submitting an article to a history of science journal. So that's happening. And I do hope that, especially for the Journal for the History of Knowledge, that we will actually have that sort of, wide sort of backgrounds, and that it's not just historians of science of the early modern period who sort of submitted, and that's not what is happening at this point. And I think that's good. That's really what I think we want. So it opens up, I think. So one of the things that it does for historians of science is that it opens up also links with other disciplines, which might have been sort of more loose or more at a distance a couple of years ago.
Next question from Grigore. Actually, Grigore has two questions. Maybe you want to integrate them.
Hi, I'm Grigore Vida. I study early modern science and philosophy in Bucharest. I also have this impression that there is a risk that the object of history of knowledge becomes too broad. But since you already touched on this, I will rephrase it as a question, namely, can you point to something that is not knowledge besides contemporary fake news, let's say?
Yeah, I think non-knowledge, ignorance of all sorts, only that isn't going to help us in sort of drawing the boundaries of the history of knowledge, because that, I think, is exactly something that the history of knowledge should actually be doing. So there you definitely have the risk of becoming a sort of history of everything. So I fully see the problem here. But you have lots, I mean, you have, lots of things which are in fact sort of not knowledge, but it's not going to help us in sort of drawing the boundaries of the discipline. I also do, I mean, to be quite honest, because we're talking about this now a long time, and also just in response to Rich's question, it would not be my sort of dream of any kind, nor do I think that would be necessary, is to sort of rebrand some history of science departments into history of knowledge departments, nor to sort of institutionalize the history of knowledge in terms of, even programs or, I don't think that is necessarily, I mean, it's fine when that happens, but that's not necessarily sort of desirable, I think.
So going back to the list of questions, we have a question from Karmesh Mehel, and she's asked me to ask it as there is some background noise in her place. So she's asking, do you see any difference between history of knowledge and a history of various, including scientific practices?
I think, but it's not cut loose. I think there's an interesting. We've just talked a bit about sort of being a word history, for example, of different knowledges as something that would be very, very interesting. I would not consider that as such as a history of practices, but of course, if you want to do that sort of, I don't know, conceptual history 2.0. It would need to be in connection to any sort of history of practices. It would not be cut loose of that. But it is more than just a history of practice. I would say. I'm not quite sure whether that's the sort of intention of the question, but that's something that I would consider not necessarily a history of practice as such, but that's something that would be quite interesting actually to undertake.
We have a question from Adam Mosley. Next, Adam.
Hi, I'm Adam Mosley. I'm yet another historian of early modern science. Sven, my question for you has to do with, I guess, the product and the product of doing history of knowledge, and who does that product need to reach? You've located the need for history of knowledge very much in the circumstances of the present. Does that mean then that for history of knowledge to be worthwhile, it needs to be reshaping something like the present? It needs to reach policymakers. What kinds of policymakers, what kinds of outcomes, effects, consequences do you see for the history of knowledge in the present circumstances?
Yeah, so it would be, I think, desirable that policymakers are actually reading the journal. I think that would be very, very desirable to actually have that sort of impact there. And so I do hope that there is, for example, one day in which people in the EU offices are actually having a copy of the Journal for the History of Knowledge in their hands, which won't be happening because we're not in print, but at least, I don't know, have their computer laptop open and looking at the journal. That would be desirable, I think, in terms of the question there is, I think, is devising a strategy in which this also might happen, because I do think that most of our readership at this point is academic. Yeah, it might be wider than a typical history of science journal. Yeah, so it might be people from a wider diversity of disciplines reading this, but still very much probably within sort of the academic circuit. And so it would be, it would be wise to devise a strategy in which we might be attracting more people. We do have, for example, with the journal, we do have, as many journals have now, we do have a blog series, etc., sort of attached to it, which draws in, I think, another public and another readership, which is not purely academic. I would imagine, and casting the web even wider, but that's still something else than being on the table of politicians and policymakers. But that's where I think we, in principle, with the field as such, not just talking as the journal, I think that's where we want to be. Yeah.
Can I follow up if I'm allowed and ask? What do you think then, if the policymakers were reading the journal, what do you think effect that would have on policy? What would change?
That's a very good question, Adam. I think that some of the ways that they're phrasing, for example, calls for research might be changing. Yeah. I mean, there's lots of talk in terms of buzzwords about, for example, something like, I find that quite striking as such. One of the things that I find striking in current policy documents around science and is that they no longer talk about, for example, science as a resource, but that they talk about or producing science or science in the pursuit, you know, in the service of particular society, but that they talk about, for example, creating transdisciplinary knowledge. And so they talk about I do have the sense that much of that is pretty unreflected. Yeah. And I do think that you can weigh with, you know, a field and as history of knowledge, you can weigh on such discussions. And that might indeed also reflect on the way these calls are being formulated and the ways that knowledge producing fields are actually seen also within a wider societal context. Yeah.
Well, to kind of add up another thought here on this particular discussion, my feeling is that right now we are approaching a problem which has been unsolved in history of science for a long time, or philosophy of science for a long time, namely the criterion of demarcation. And since I taught a whole semester a course on the criterion of demarcation, I can tell you that that's a very thorny nut, or very tough nut, very difficult to crack. And after 14 weeks of struggling with master students to deal with various criteria of demarcation, we were all defeated by it. And as it was philosophy of science at some point. So are you kind of trying to approach this from a different angle? Are you so are we in the big question of, can we demarcate between real knowledge and non-knowledge?
Not in the sort of absolute term that you're talking about. I think the demarcation problem would be an interesting, but not in those terms. Yeah, but you can, I think, sort of historicize that question and talk about how not just between science and non-science, but between different types of knowledge, or you sort of make these demarcations throughout history. So yes, I think that's something that you can do. Whether you can actually sort of solve that in this sort of you know, philosophical sense that you've just mentioned, I don't think so. I don't think you can. That's not something that history of knowledge can do, but it can historicize that question. Yeah.
But Grigore's question is very good here. Grigore, can you address it?
Yeah, it could be that you already answered. Do you think there could be a companion discipline, something like the history of ignorance?
I not only think that it can be, I think it exists. I mean, the study of ignorance does exist, even as a name, agnotology, and it has historical components. And one of the things that you actually see, and it's not just in the journal, so there is a special issue on ignorance coming up later this year. But that is a field in the making, yeah, as part of a much wider field of the study of ignorance, which already exists, which has books with those titles, and you know, especially in sociology, for example, is not exactly a small thing. So yeah, I think so. It's there. It's too late for us to invent it. It already exists. Yeah.
So Carmen has another question, which is actually quite practical. Where is this discipline located within the universities? What departments, if any, are hiring historians of knowledge? Her sense is that at least for now, many are housed within other more established fields, from history of science all the way to English or other literature. Do you think this will change in the near future?
I'm not sure that it will change, nor do I know whether that's absolutely desirable to actually have a sort of the department of the history of knowledge. So what I do see is that historians of knowledge, or people who would, publish in a history of knowledge journal or identify themselves through that label, is that they're mostly housed, I think, within, not necessarily history of science departments specifically, but within history departments more broadly, as well as in some neighboring fields. So there are quite a few people in art history, in literature, history of literature, literature studies, etc., who identify with that label. So I think that's where they are. So not only in history, but also in other humanistic disciplines.
Actually, quite related to this, do you think there should be, let's say, not a department, but what about society for the history of knowledge? So should there be some kind of meetings to discuss this this notion and promote it?
Be my guest.
Careful what you answer, because we might found it tonight,
Yeah, if you want to do it, do that. I think what is it? So the journal as such, I mean, is basically, it's owned by the what was originally what people say is the sort of the Dutch Society for the History of Science. Only it's been not the Dutch, even in its name, not being the Dutch Society for the History of Science for quite a while. I mean, the full name actually says it's the history of, I think it's science, humanities, medicine, and universities for quite some time, which if you all add up to that, you might pretty much come close to the history of knowledge, perhaps. So whether they want to rebrand it as the history of knowledge, I think they might be doing that at some point. I know there also in the Netherlands there's some programs where, at least, I mean, courses are being renamed as about being specifically history of knowledge, and where even I think it still exists, there is sort of a minor in a program which is a sort of a history of knowledge minor. So it is being used more and more in that sense. But again, I mean, to me, that's a I think it's a secondary question. I don't think it's the more important question here, the institutionalization question. But that's I mean, so if people want to establish the Society for the History of Knowledge, go ahead, would be good. As long, I would say, that society would be sort of really investing also in a journal like ours, because boy, it is expensive to actually keep that running.
Okay. Can I also ask, just to give us an idea of how the journal actually started, since we were at this topic?
So the journal was basically established the decision was made to establish it in 2019 by the the Dutch Society for the History of Science, and the long name. And so what was important, I think, for them was that it actually had that sort of broad umbrella and that category, as well as, I think, very much that it is an open access journal. And it's open access in the sense it's diamond open access. So that's basically that there is no cost, not for reading it, but also not for being an author in it. So it's very much sort of an embracement, and that was very important also for the society, a sort of embracement of what you might call inclusive authorship. So the shift towards open access, I mean, definitely comes with there's always somebody paying, to publish. So the article processing charges. In our case, it's the society, as well as a number of research centers in the Netherlands, so in Utrecht, in Amsterdam, and in somewhere else. Yeah, so sorry. So the major research centers for the history of science and the humanities, et cetera, who are basically paying for this, which means that even without a sort of big bag of money through a research project as a junior researcher, or perhaps also a researcher of a university outside the Netherlands, in different parts of the world where there might not be that much sort of funding available, can sort of publish in the journal without there being any sort of costs, which can be immense and huge in the open access world. So these were things that were very much important to the society, and the reason to actually establish it. Perhaps even more important than really rebranding it as a history of knowledge field, which seemed like almost a logical outcome in a certain sense for where things were moving in the Netherlands, where there has been, for example, a very strong emphasis also on the history of humanities, something that is very much present within the landscape.
Coming back for a moment to the definition of this object, history of knowledge, Daria Drozdova.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, I'm here. Thank you. I was actually writing a brief note, if I may, to be back to the question of institutions and the place of history of knowledge in the academia, because at HEC in Moscow, we have an institute for theoretical and historical research. And I suppose they do exactly history of knowledge, because they do history of universities, history of medicine, history of humanities, and history of rhetoric, and so on. And so they practically are in the academia, but it's exactly, they have difficulties to find the like disciplinary like a part in this, because it seems that institute is related to history, so should be more related to historical department. But they are like being in intermediate space between history, philosophy, and other disciplines. For example, the head of the institute is philosopher for now. And seeing that in these histories, history of science, history of knowledge, and so on, the philosophical part is very important. There was my question about these presuppositions, about the third world of Popper. Do you think that in some sense, speaking about knowledge, about producing of knowledge, about distribution of knowledge, about knowledge existing in books, you're speaking about this third world? Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't catch the last sentence.
Do you think this third world of Popper is a presupposition of this field of history of knowledge? Because you are doing mostly the history of this Popperian world of knowledge existing in books, in some sense.
I'm not quite sure whether that is in fact true, because a large part of what the history of knowledge, I mean, there's an important part of the history of knowledge, which is about the history of practical and tacit knowledge, which is being methodologically also assessed by, performative methods of sort of redoing, reenactment, reconstruction. And so that wouldn't actually fit into, so that does not belong. Of course, there is a relation there, and there are interesting questions to ask about, codification of knowledge, the relation between books and practical and tacit knowledge. Interesting question might, for example, be about the invention of the manual. There's been an interesting, special issue, I think, of another history of science journal about learning by the book. So it's the history of the manual, and manuals. So people learn actually from books. So there are interesting questions there, I think, for the history of knowledge. but there is a whole part of it where it's not about, I mean, the book as such. Yeah. So so tacit knowledge, practical knowledge, I think is a very, very important part of what a history of knowledge is. In that sense, it doesn't belong. There's something else I wanted to actually say, which we haven't been touching upon in terms of institutionalization. So one of the things that is, of course, also very much true, or is there, and we haven't pointed out, is that there is, especially within different European traditions, there are things which are very much like history of knowledge, which have moved into now sort of that larger umbrella of history of knowledge. So you have, I mean, we've talked about this a couple of, so Wissensgeschichte in the German, which has a long history, but you have similar things in France where you talk about Histoire des Savoirs, which is now sort of rebranded in a more international frame as history of knowledge. And you have them in Scandinavian Nordic countries. You also have something like Idea Historia, which is now also moved into the sort of, so you have these sort of traditions which are basically there. I mean, there are different articles about that in the first issue of the Journal for the History of Knowledge. So that's also there, yeah. So it's also not surprising, but it would be very much interesting to learn outside of these language areas whether there are other sorts of sort of traditions which are already there.
I should say that in Russian, there is no exact concept for science. We have a concept more close to Wissenschaft. So when we are speaking about history of science, Historia Nauki, it's not about natural sciences or only about natural sciences. It's about humanities as well. So we have this problem to connect our history of science to Western history of science.
Yeah. So I think that would be
let me add
another interesting project for the history of knowledge as such. And if you ever tell that history of the history of knowledge, I think that would be definitely something that would be interesting and be part of this. But then on a more global scale. Yeah.
Let me add to Daria's question two more things. One is that in my parents' generation in Romania, philosophy was Marxist philosophy, of course, sort of Marxist philosophy. And the fundamental presupposition of that was that there is one truth, which is somehow connected with Marx's philosophy of history. And you have to rewrite the history of knowledge, okay, by which they meant the history of theories that were approaching or departing this unique truth, in order to show how they reached the Marxist point of view. They call this theory of knowledge, and that was what was taught in the universities, theory of knowledge. So for people in Romania, in generations that were taught in this tradition, saying history of knowledge would immediately bring to their memory this particular, not very happy memory of their students' days. And in this way, I would like to connect a bit, or to push forward a bit, the idea of Popper's third world. Because if we take, okay, we don't think of books now, but we do think in terms of the Popperian third world, which contains all the knowledge that reaches the level of knowledge. That doesn't necessarily have to be connected with a dogma or with a theory or with a book, but everything which can be spelled out as knowledge is a kind of common property of humanity and inhabits this third world, including, let's say, tacit knowledge once it is spelled out. And when we write an article about tacit knowledge of this and that process, we basically spell out that tacit knowledge. So Popper would say, well, it's not tacit anymore. You have spelled it out. It's in the third world. So do you see here a kind of tacit presupposition of common world of knowledge, a common world of knowledge in which you put all these bits and pieces that somehow reach the threshold of being knowledge? Because it would be the time to introduce questions that are historicizing knowledge. But before that, maybe we have to. It would be interesting to hear what you think about this.
No, I think that's a fascinating. I've never, I mean, to be quite honest, never thought about the object of the history of knowledge in those terms. I think what would be the main difference, my sense, would be the main difference between that older idea, which is new to me, I've never heard of this before, this older idea of a theory of knowledge as it existed in Romania, and the history of knowledge as we, I think, practice it now, is that the actors of knowledge are much more diverse, I assume, than what it used to be within that particular philosophical tradition that you're talking about. And I think that might be a main difference. And yes, I think all these actors would at least try to belong to that third world, to that world of as you call it. And so there is a sort of, but it would be equally interesting to actually ask the question why they want to do that. And I think that's a perfectly legit and perhaps even the more interesting question, yeah, to ask at any moment is why actors are actually sort of branding themselves and labeling themselves as producers of knowledge. And so I think that's an interesting question. Yeah.
Okay, next question comes from Ariana Borelli. Ariana, can you ask the question yourself?
Yes, thanks. Yes, that fits well, I think, with what was just discussed. My question is, I've always had the very vague impression that this very broad knowledge that we have today, which was now discussed as is very much linked to the Popper's third world, is actually a modern thought, or maybe modern and Western, you know? that you have this overarching knowledge, and then of course different kinds, possibly also linked to the emergence of scientific knowledge. And so, okay, this is my impression. My question to you would be, would you agree, or would you think, it seems maybe what you said, that actually knowledge in that sense could be seen as an actor's category in pre-modern times? Of course, clearly we can interpret that it's not a problem for the history of knowledge, looking at these elements of the cloud as parts of the history of knowledge. But do you think that these pre-modern actors, or even non-Western actors, would see themselves as producer of knowledge as we would mean it today? This is a very tricky question, but I try to think.
Yeah, the connection wasn't perfect. I mean, on my side wasn't excellent, Ariana. So
I'm so sorry.
But I think I got the gist of the of what you are asking. And I think your impression that knowledge is a recent modern category is absolutely true. I think it's even very, very recent in the way that it's being so ubiquitously used all the time. I think it's something from probably the 1980s and not earlier than that you see this pop up everywhere. And the knowledge society, as we know, is a category that's invented in Scandinavia in the 1970s and not before that. And so all these sort of categories that come sort of attached to it, without that's something of the 90s. So it's very, very recent. So in response to your question, I think there is no such thing as the way that particular sort of knowledge container, as it is, that particular meaning, that it actually is there before the 1980s. It's different. And so you get into exactly the same problems with the container of knowledge as historians of science have had with the container of science, and we know that these are very, very problematic, issues. So we get in exactly the same set of questions. So yeah, I agree. Yeah, But as with the theory, the general theory of knowledge that should be sort of unifying the field of history of knowledge, I do not have a perfect solution to that at this point. But I wonder whether it would be great to have it, but I wonder whether it does not disqualify, I think, some of the I think very legitimate and important questions that can be asked. But,
absolutely not. That was not actually, it makes them even more interesting. Thank you.
I would like to add a point here. I mean, it's it is interesting. When I was reading Peter Burke's book. I was thinking that whether this knowledge society. I mean, okay, where did this term come from? And it seemed to me like. A lot of this modern knowledge view is driven by the computers, by the internet developments. It was interesting because he was making a distinction between information and knowledge, which was actually quite strange to me because when I was studying, I did a minor in management information systems, and at the time, at least, information was seen as something superior to data. I mean, data was seen as, let's say, raw pieces of, information. Let's say, I don't know how to call it, raw pieces of data, and then information would be synthesized in some way. So information would be a superior form. And then suddenly this knowledge idea appeared that at first it was called information society, but then information became too computer related in some way, the whole IT framework. So they use knowledge society. But it still seems to be like it's related to this whole process of the infusion of information into society by means of the internet. And whether this infusion is actually knowledge, this is somehow also the question. I mean, how much is just still pieces of information or pieces of data that people have to reassemble in their brain in some way, and they produce their own knowledge, or whether this is my question, I guess, is also related about knowledge as being top down, infused via this kind of social media devices, and whether it actually comes back up, let's say, from data that you reassemble in your brain, and you think that you have knowledge because you reconstituted this. And I think this is where the game is played at the moment in some way. Is the knowledge coming now from social media, from friends, from let's say people that we see as experts? Do we reassemble this in our brain and we come up with theories that are completely different? I don't know. I'm going with this in the sense that I find it interesting because this knowledge is becoming such a disputed thing, and it's somewhere in the middle of all these players that somehow seem to own the knowledge.
Right. I think even also the distinction between information and knowledge is often taught in terms, including by Burke, but also by others, in terms of the raw and the cooked. So that's the obvious. I think there is, and I think Peter Burke also touches upon that. I think there is a sort of at least one sort of strand within, what he sees as history of knowledge would be a sort of history of knowledge from below. So it's not a sort of top down. I think that's in a sense what we're talking about. You have that sort of from below history. It would be very interesting in a sense to talk about history of medical knowledge from the patient's perspective. But I'm sure there are historians of medicine at this point who actually do this, of course. But that would be, I think, something. that can be done. By the way, on the knowledge society and the invention, I mean, there's a great book which I can advertise, I think, because it isn't mine, but it is invented in a particular sort of context of the welfare state in Sweden in the 1970s, and so it's published by, I think, Östling and Hammar in the I'm editing a series on knowledge societies and history with Routledge, and so it's published in there. So that's why I know where this is, what this is coming from, and that's an interesting book. If you ever want to know about the origins of that particular term, that's where it's that's the book to turn to. It's somewhere behind me, but I'm sure that if I try to find it now, I will not be able to find it. So I will do that.
Well,
you have another question related? Yes, go ahead, Jo.
No, please go ahead. I was seeing that you're feeling hot there, so I was trying to help.
I'm melting in Bucharest, very, very hot. I was wondering whether Carmen has sorted out her sound, because she has a question.
I will try. Thank you. Okay, let's see. So I have a question on methodology, and I wanted to ask, are there any kinds of methods of analysis that are typical for this for the new field of the history of knowledge? Meaning, for example, when you get one article in, how do you assess that article? How do you how can you tell this is a typical article of history of knowledge? Do you have criteria? You certainly have criteria. I'm just curious for you if you can spell them out. So in other words, what are some actions of the discipline, like some basic fundamental assumptions that that you work with in the discipline? And I wanted to ask this because scholarly communities often coagulate, if not according to content, because the content in this case is way too diverse, if not according to institutions, because we don't have that many institutions for the history of knowledge, then often scholars form small communities according to methods.
Mm-hmm. I don't think that's the case for us in the history of knowledge. I would be actually hard pressed to actually point to any particular method that would be specific to the history of knowledge. I think it's really sort of a toolbox with methods from quite different disciplines. I mean, including the history of the book, as well as material culture studies and other fields. So I think it would be quite diverse, but nothing that I think I could actually name that is specific to the history of knowledge. So that's not where we actually draw the line. I think we try to be, because this is also a new field, we try to be quite, inclusive and open about what it actually is. I think it's one of the questions to be open and transparent. It's one of the central questions that we actually ask to all reviewers of an article that actually comes in. We try to be very careful at this stage not to desk reject things unless it's absolutely clear that it is not history of knowledge. And in those cases, I must say it is absolutely clear that it's not history of knowledge, because it would be a typical, because it often lacks, in the cases that I'm thinking of, it lacks actually an historical argument. Yeah. So it might be something that would be a perfect fit, for example, in, let's say, I don't know, philosophy of medicine, but there isn't a history. There isn't an historical argument in there. Then it's not something that we would actually consider, because we do consider ourselves as a historical, a journal on history. But beyond that, so it's a question that we actually ask that goes out to reviewers, that goes out to our advisory board members. And so it is, as with all new fields, it's something that you sort of try to determine yourself. I think there's low and higher relevance to the field and history of knowledge. We do not exclude things which might be history of science or history of technology, or these history of humanities as such. But we do think that things which are sort of crossing, for example, a bridge between, and are more encompassing in terms of knowledge, that's something that is perhaps more typical for what a journal for this journalist can publish. And so that would be higher on our agenda of priorities. But at this point, it's very much about, trying to be as inclusive as possible, I think. That's rejecting hardly anything unless it's absolutely clear that it is not history, and see in one way how the fields, reviewers, advisory board members, in addition to ourselves, are actually defining what that field could become. I would say would be my answer. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering if you've already had cases of. I'm just thinking that when you say inclusive, there should be probably some limits to how much you can include. I'm just wondering if you had to make a value judgment as to what is knowledge in terms of let's say contemporary issues. I don't know if you have had any submission, but I'm just wondering if someone comes in and says, okay, I'll do a history of the COVID crisis, and starts to affirm that he has this kind of knowledge about, I don't know, what happened in China, and things that are not settled as being knowledge per se. There's not a consensus to what has actually happened. Would you accept it, or would you? How would you approach such a submission?
I think the most important thing for us is that it's making an historical argument. Yeah. So if this is an assessment, from purely a contemporary perspective in which there is no historical argument, it's probably not something for us. But in principle, the COVID crisis now has, it can be very recent history. Yeah. That's not an issue. That would, we have examples of that, and we will publish examples of that. So that's not an issue as such. And I think
conspiracy theories.
We welcome that to counterbalance the idea that that the history of knowledge would be primarily a field for the pre-modern period. Yeah.
How about histories of conspiracy theories?
I think that would be excellent and great. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so you might get some submissions. Andrei Marashoyu has a question.
Right, so you can hear me well, right?
Andrei?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Another naive question from me. Right at the start of the cafe, I think I heard Sven say that the history of knowledge is also concerned with the materiality of knowledge. And if so, I was just wondering what that is. And I guess the context was, forensic science or something like that is dependent on materials in quite a special way. That's very different from, say, the way that astronomy became a science once telescopes were invented. And that's quite different from, what preserving manuscripts and these kind of philological traditions is doing. And that again seems very different from the kind of dissections and postmortems and so on that medical students need to perform, and so on. So I was just wondering what materiality is here. Is it all of that? Is it? Yeah. Thanks so much.
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure that it can be it's an enormous diversity of material objects, and that they're not limited to scientific instruments. I think that focus within the history of knowledge as a field is probably coming in through the fact that there's so much emphasis often on not just how knowledge is produced, but also how it circulates. And so it can only circulate through I would argue, true material carriers of knowledge. And so that's where the materiality and the study of materiality actually comes in. Yeah. Yeah, that's.
So would this by any chance also involve a history of technology, for instance?
Yes, I think it is. I think it is. So we do have. So history of technology would indeed be involved in this. I think the history of technology has also interesting things to learn. For example, especially also, I think exactly perhaps in terms also of circulation. I mean, if you focus on circulation, which a lot of the field is doing, not just in history of knowledge, but also in the history of science. It's also always about knowledge on the move, in a sense. There is a risk that you start to sort of fetishize movement, mobility, and that you only focus on that. But at the expense of actually talking about what remains continuous and stable, and the work that actually goes into preserving something and keeping it stable. And I think the history of technology as such has interesting things to learn there, because it currently sees a shift away from, as it always had, very much a focus, I think, on innovation, towards a focus on practices of maintenance, etc., which are ways of actually talking about, I think, stability and continuity. And that's what, historians of science and technology moving towards, I mean, this very much a focus on circulation and transformation and change seem to be sort of missing, or might run the risk of missing. Yeah. So I think there's something to gain here from bringing all these different fields also together at that level.
One more quick follow-up, only if I'm allowed. Would this, if it involves technology, would it also involve something like knowledge enhancing policies? So which sort of policies tend to encourage innovation, and which sort of policies tend to stifle creativity and scientific research and so on? Would that kind of political knowledge, if you will, also pertain to the field that you're sort of
yeah, I think that politicization is actually is crucial and is key to actually what the field is. Yeah, so I've talked a lot, I think, about epistemic hierarchy, shifting boundaries, etc. That also is, of course, is very much, as we know from different philosophical traditions, also a political question at heart. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
I was wondering, since we haven't talked too much about, let's say, widening boundaries as being one of the topics that history of knowledge can do. I mean, basically pushing the time limits, creating macro histories, also pushing space limits. Being more towards global history, let's say. And I'm just wondering, I mean, with macro histories, of course, it's more like in terms of books. I guess it's harder to do in terms of an article. And well, I'm just wondering if how you see that remaining within the boundaries of, let's say, a learned discourse as opposite to a public discourse as well.
So you're asking about the opportunities for history of knowledge to sort of expand the geographical and temporal boundaries of,
Yes,
so
exactly.
talking. Yeah, I think it has. And I think it might have to do, in fact, also with this sort of focus on mobility very much. So you can talk about both, I mean, geographical circulation as well as temporal circulation. And so I think focusing on that has quite the, the consequence, of course, is that you can both tell sort of long-term histories as well as move outside, these very sort of confined geographical confines of micro histories. And the history of knowledge, I think one of the things is that it has been doing, and that many people sort of touch upon is this sort of embracement of a sort of more global scope and perspective, which is something that also the journal is very much sort of engaging with. And I think it's globalization in two ways. I think it's globalization in the sense that it talks about how knowledge actually becomes a global phenomenon. And that, on the other hand, it actually also talks about globalization in terms which are more, or not purely in terms of a sort of distribution of a particular notion of knowledge from a particular center towards the peripheries, but that get much more sort of complicated history there, which focuses on appropriation, about transformation, about change, and which really also shows, for example, as Morel Chakri has done, how even the notion of knowledge and science as something that is modern and Western is being produced in, you know, Egypt and China, rather than that's something that is actually coming out of a European context.
I mean, linked to this, I think it's quite interesting. I mean, as far as I know, that obviously global history is a big thing at the moment. But actually, let's say macro histories or big histories are still seen as somehow flaky, or let's say not proper scholarship, because it's supposedly loses some of this specificity and the nuance of let's say each era. And it's also been accused of being presentist in a way, trying to integrate, let's say, a concept, looking at it throughout history. It's always been, I mean, it has been done, but now it's, I mean, this micro history is seen as more scholarly in a way. And I was just wondering what if you think of ways of making, how you can make micro history you know, acceptable, you know, public loves it, but how do you make the scholars like it as well?
Yeah, I think we might be running into exactly the same problems as historians of science are running now, writing sort of these macro stories. I mean, I think there have been several attempts more recently, and they're not, I mean, in general, not all very, I think you try to point out, not all very favorably sort of reviewed.
Sorry to interrupt, but can we give some examples of the things you are referring to?
Yeah, I think there's yeah, sure. I mean, there's Stephen Shapin's book about scientific revolution. There is a recent a book by Ofer Gal about it. They get very mixed reviews, regardless of what I actually sort of think of them. But I think that it's just, you know, that we will run into the same problem with the history of knowledge for exactly the same reasons. I mean, these books become problematic because that notion of science that they carry and the baggage that it carries with it is something that we no longer, as an historian of science community, actually believe in. We know it's much more complicated than that. Yeah. And the same will actually go for knowledge. We point out all the time. I mean, much of tonight has been about this cloud, right? And so we run into exactly the same problem. What it will be, and I think where there's much more sort of possibilities of actually achieving that, is that it will be, and I see examples of that, really sort of decentering the history of knowledge, so that it will be no longer the sort of very much you know, focused on Europe, also not for the early modern periods. So I do see that, yeah, and I think that is perfectly possible to do that in either a connective or a comparative way, and I do see that happening. Yeah. So, for example, the history of bureaucracy issue of bureaucratic knowledge that we've published, that contains basically stories about bureaucratic knowledge across the globe without actually being sort of no longer privileging 19th century Prussia, from which Max Weber's notion actually derived, right? So that is there, and I think there are possibilities there, the possibilities there to do that, and I think that's more easy and perhaps also in some ways more urgent than actually telling again these sort of macro histories on a temporal scale, which I think will be very difficult for notions, whether that's science or whether that's knowledge or ignorance or whatever. That's just going to be and continue to be very, very difficult to do.
Yeah, maybe that's the moment to introduce the so popular theme of the historical epistemology. So history of science has kind of reached the bottom line where concepts are very historically determined. And therefore you cannot talk about science across centuries or anything across centuries. It looks like knowledge would be the last stronghold or whatever of anti-historicizing, because, okay, science is historically determined, natural philosophy or philosophy is historically determined, but when you say that you have knowledge of or you know something, this is we think, or it seems to be intuitively less historicized. Do you agree with this point of view?
No, I don't think I agree. I do not think that it's less historicized. I think it's equally, historicized. If you talk about, especially if you talk about both the term as such, and so knowledge in 1980 does not mean the same as, so you cannot sort of push that back in time. Even, I mean, you do not need to go back to the early modern period, but even in 1950, knowledge would not be the same. And so I think it's equally, it's as, historical contingent, I think, as any of these other terms, whether that's science or technology, which, as we know, is also an invention in the way we use it of the 20th century in a sense. So I don't think it, I think it is as historical contingent. So this is not going to be a solution out of that problem.
But then the question is, how is history of this possible? I mean, it's just an encyclopedic overview of what people have ever thought that knowledge is in different times, which is not history in any sense of the word. So you are in the same conundrum as the history of science is.
I think we are, to be quite honest. So if the history of knowledge, I think, is not a way out of that particular conundrum. At least I don't see that. Yeah. I think it can draw attention to more and different forms of knowledge, but it's not a way out of the plurality issue. Yeah. So. And not a way out of the issue of historical contingency. It's not. According to me, it's not. Yeah.
Grigore has a version of this question, more precise. Grigore, if you want to ask it.
No, I think Sven already replied to this. It seems to me that the history of knowledge is prone to the same errors as the older history of science. I was thinking whether microhistories of episteme, techne, and scientia would be more historically accurate. But also the discipline is probably too young to have a historical turn. But in a way, you replied to all of this already.
Yeah, but I think that's
like the history of knowledge is a little sister of history of science at this time. It has the same problems and is prone to the same errors.
Yeah, I don't know whether they're errors. So I would argue against that. These are errors of the discipline. Yeah, so I don't think they're errors. But there might be problems depending on what you are. But I think the suggestion that is in there of writing histories of particular terms and types of knowledge that come with particular words, I think you can perfectly write a history of, for example, techne. And I think that is possible, yeah. And that does not fall into, as far as I see it, does not fall into sort of the the trap of eventually saying, well, it's all a sort of historical contingent and there's discontinued, blah, blah, etc. So I do think that that's meaningful to do so in the same way that writing a history of objectivity is meaningful and is possible, as we know.
Well, speaking of, I mean, I guess it's a bit late to get into all this, but I mean, there is also an argument to be made about creating macro histories in the sense that, for instance, I mean, you can approach, let's say, a human trait, or let's say a human emotion, or you know, approach it, let's say, from a historical point of view, or something that has been done, let's say, for centuries, and approach it historically. You know, not try to, let's say, give it a modern take, but try to understand how that notion, you know, changed. Let's say what love is. Let's say you can do a macro history on that, and you can write about how love was seen in Greece and how love was seen in the medieval period. And I mean, I wouldn't see that as problematic as doing a history of, let's say, knowledge as contemporary knowledge projected into the past. And linked to this, I'm just wondering how you feel about you know, people like Harari, obviously, who write about the Anthropocene, and you know, they take this grand vision, and I mean, it has a huge impact, you know, on society. And I mean, I was surprised to see that it's actually it seeps down into academia. I mean, if it's popular enough with the public, somehow it becomes scholarly. I mean, scholarship is also, these days at least, it seems to be, you know, receiving at the receiving end of this kind of paradigms or new ideas that come from the public, and they adapt it to scholarship. Yeah. I'm just thinking what you think about this this relationship between the public and the scholarship. I mean, it seems to the public seems to also have a knowledge that scholarship eventually adopts in some way.
Yeah, I think my primary reaction would be to this would be, I think that it would be perhaps a misconception to think that there is a distinction or a clear divide between, on the one hand, scholarship, and on the other hand, the public sphere. I think in many cases, I mean, scholarship is actually made in and with the public as such. And I think, I mean, and that again would be for, I mean, in the history of knowledge would be interesting projects, projects about, you know, citizen science, for example, and the history of that are interesting, I think, for history, for history of knowledge. And in a sense, I mean, it's not a new idea. I mean, I think it's very Flackian in a sense. There's nothing new about it. So I think it's perfectly okay, and especially if it is popular. I mean, I think that's good. It does not disqualify us, I think, from actually engaging with it. I do think that that's a reason for us to engage with it. Yeah, and that's good. So I think it's a perfectly legitimate, so what you mentioned, to write sort of a history of a category, love or whatever, through these periods, and just do it for the sake of actually writing that history. That's perfect. That's perfectly okay. What is even more interesting, perhaps, is writing such a history and being able to relate it to something that is at stake today. I mean, turning, for example, to something, I was quite surprised that people talking about how to deal with medical errors, for example, are turning to artistic theories of error from the Renaissance to actually sort of engage with that in the debate today, which is hugely important. And so we might be able to offer something as historians, yeah, something that is relevant and that people are talking about. So that I think is good. I would welcome that.
Well, I guess we are close to the end. So if you'd like to say a few words about why we should publish in the journal and how do we do it? I mean, do we just write to you, or do we submit an abstract?
So you should actually just go to the website. So General History of Knowledge, you will find us. I think we publish two different things. We publish on the one hand on a sort of rolling basis standalone articles. So you just submit it. Throughout the year, we try to publish fast at no cost, as I said. It's very properly reviewed, but in constructive ways. Yeah. And we also publish special issues for which we have an annual call. We do one special issue a year. The next one, now call for 2023, is actually a deadline by the end of this month. So if you want to be part of that, you need to be fast. But go to the website, you will see that, and there will be another call for 2024, and it takes some time to do it. So if not this year, then perhaps next year. So please do so. And I would very much welcome, I mean, also submissions, I think, from Romania, but also from larger part, that particular sort of more eastern part of Europe, which I feel we do not have sufficient submissions of. We have at this moment more submissions from East Asia than from the eastern part of Europe. I'm very happy that we're global in scope, but I do hope, and I think there's lots of interesting scholarship going on in that part of the world where you are. And so I would love to see more of submissions from that part. Whether you are a student, just beginning, or a very senior scholar, we publish quality. That's the only thing that counts.
Thank you. So that's a lesson to take home with us. We have discussed tonight about a new journal, relatively new, about a new field. I wonder what will happen in 10 years with this field, and I'm very glad that this conversation will remain somewhere out in the cloud as a historical document of the beginning of a new field, history of knowledge. Sven, thank you so much. Jo, thank you for co-hosting it with me, and thank you all for being with us, either on Zoom or on YouTube. And I will see some of you next week for the last installment of the Philosophical Cafe. Until then, the very best. Bye-bye.
Thank you.